Oh my goodness. I just realized I forgot to read the chapter for you today from Jip. So I'm going to read it now. I will post it. Probably it will be around 8:30 or so. So don't worry if you don't read it tonight with me. Um, you can read it tomorrow. That's fine. All right, but this chapter is called Newcomers. All right, so you remember that Putt is now, I always have to do this when I start a new chapter, and I'm sure you do too, to go back and think about exactly where I left off, right? So Jip has now experienced Putt having one of his rages, and we left him feeling so sad that he couldn't tame this one creature, right? He had found a beast he couldn't tame at will. It was like to break his young heart. Chapter 3, Newcomers. Putt came to himself later that day, but the residents were now more wary of him. Sheldon grabbed Jip's arm and begged him not to go into the cage room. He cried like a child when Jip persisted. Jip never wanted to hurt Sheldon, but Putt was, well, he was Putt, and he belonged to Jip in a way no one else ever had. There was no way of knowing when one of the spells would come over the man. Whenever Putt was out of the cage for even the briefest time, the anxious twittering about of the manager and his wife tainted any small taste of freedom Jip could offer to his friend. So it sounds like Jip has convinced them to let Putt out of the cage some of the time. Only Jip remained faithful, daring, when the weather was fair, to take Putt out as far as the pasture, so that he could feel the sun on his face and welcome the slow approach of Vermont spring. There were new lambs to count, and as if to dispel her luckless reputation once and for all, Bonnie dropped yet another healthy calf, a heifer at that. Putt continued in his right mind through the end of April and right on into early May. Perhaps the lengthening of the days cheered his troubled soul, for he sang his songs and played upon a wooden pipe he told Jip how to fashion, as he was never allowed anything sharper than his pewter spoon. So he had asked Jip to carve him, using a knife, to carve him a wooden pipe that he could play. He was in his peaceful phase the afternoon the widow Wilkins appeared, her 3 unhappy children in tow. Jip's heart danced to see more children come to the farm, having been for all his life there the only one. The oldest was even near to his own size, though a girl. The next was a bit of a boy, just coming into speech, and the youngest a baby girl, still on the breast, so she was still drinking her mother's milk. So this is a family. We're going to find out why, but this is a family that has now come to live on the town poor farm. So the mother and 3 unhappy children, and she's called the widow Wilkins. A widow is someone whose husband has died. The widow's husband had been, Bertha informed them all, the town's most notorious drunk. Then, during the last big snow, he fell on his way home and froze to death in a snowdrift. An empty bottle of illegal spirits was found nearby. So illegal spirits would be alcohol. No one counted his death much of a loss, though Jip wondered if his wife and children had. They surely might. Still, the taxpayer soon felt the pinch, for the drunkard had left nothing behind save debts, so the responsibility for his family's care fell upon the town. So when he died, there was nothing left for his widow and their children to live on, so they ended up going to the town poor farm. Jip ran out to meet the newcomers with delight, a delight that was met with cold stares from everyone except for a shy smile from the little boy. "Show the Wilkinsons the empty room next to the gentlemen's quarters," Mrs. Lyman said primly. Gentleman was not a word she was accustomed to use to describe the male residents of the farm. "Just follow me, then," Jip called out, running up the stairs. He turned to the top to watch the labored ascent of the new residents. Lucy, the girl, was carrying a large carpet bag, bumping it from step to step, while her mother juggled the baby on her right hip and dragged the little boy upward with her left hand. "Lift your feet, Toddy, for mercy's sake. Just lift your feet." Jip went back down, thinking at least to help Lucy with a huge bag, but when he reached for the handles, she snatched it away. "It's ours," she said, as though he had been intent on stealing it from her. "I just thought to give you a hand with it," he said, confused. "You have a monstrous dirty face." Jip shook his head and climbed back up to the landing. He didn't tell her that her face wasn't so clean either. Why should he? He knew a herding animal when he saw one. There was no need to pain her further. So he can tell that Lucy is hurting inside. At the supper table, which filled the center of the drab kitchen, the widow and her children sat huddled together at the far side near Mrs. Lyman. The little boy's nose hardly scraped the splintery tabletop. Mr. Lyman served the bowls of mush from the kettle and passed them down. Lucy looked at hers, her face twisting as though she felt nauseous. That means sick to her stomach. Her mother poked both her and Toddy and bent to say something sharp and low. Reluctantly, both children picked up their spoons. Jip didn't wait to see how much they ate. He only waited until he had Putt's bowl and took it with a spoon down the hall to the cage room. Here you are, Putt. Jip passed the bowl and spoon through the trap door. Hot, at least. The old man sniffed the steaming mush. Ah, one of Mrs. Lyman's culinary triumphs. When he smiled like that, his teeth didn't seem so large and menacing. When he says one of Mrs. Lyman's culinary triumphs, I don't think he really means it. I think he's being sarcastic. Culinary means cooking, what you do in the kitchen, cooking. So he's saying, oh, what a wonderful dish for Mrs. Lyman. But I'm not sure he means it. We got new residents. Putt counted on Jip to bring the news of the world outside the cage room. A widow Wilkins and her young'uns. Berthy says the mister died in the March storm. There's unluckier people in this world than you nor me, Jip, the old man said, settling back against the slats with his supper. I reckon. It was a new thought to Jip. He never regarded himself as lucky or unlucky. He was just Jip, just here. But he had pitied his friend, a lunatic and a pauper to boot. Was Putt right? Was it unluckier still to be the orphan child of a drunken father? Jip returned to the big kitchen in his own cool mush, determined to be especially kind to the prickly Lucy. Make him stop looking at me, Ma, Lucy whispered hoarsely. In answer, Mrs. Wilkins reached past Toddy and gave Lucy's face a slap. Mind your manners, girl. Yes, thought Jip, there's some that's unluckier than me. He felt truly lucky a few days later. He was going into town. A trip into the village for anything besides Sunday services at the Congregational Church was always something of an adventure. Jip liked to study the variety of horses and people on the busy street, to hear the rattle of wagons, the call of greetings. He wished for a cap. If he had a cap to tip, he could have joined in the proper howdy-doos and good morning to yous and made a wise pronouncement on the weather. So he could have said, howdy-do, fine morning. Since the day that Lucy had made mention of his face, he had taken more care to splash cold water on it and wipe it carefully on the tail of his shirt. This day he looked down at the raw red hands sticking out of his skimpy sleeves and washed them as well. There was no mirror over the pump, only the wavy one over the kitchen sink, but he ran his fingers through his tangled curls and patted them to his head. There, at least he felt handsomer. Where you off to? Lucy had come out to the pump. Me and Mr. Lyman got to take the heifer in to sell. He lowered his voice. I got to help. The man's got no way with critters. Oh. He tried to figure out if she was wanting to go too, but he knew Mr. Lyman wouldn't allow it. He wouldn't even let Sheldon go into town on errands. I can't be bothered taking care of the idjit, he'd say when Jip begged on Sheldon's behalf, knowing how Sheldon did so love to go places. Though in truth it would be Jip taking care of both beast and man. So Mr. Lyman doesn't want to let Sheldon go. And Jip wishes that he would let Sheldon go, but he knows that if he did, Jip would have to take care of both the animals and Sheldon too. So they're going to take the heifer in to sell. That was the calf that was born. It's grown up enough that they can take it in to sell. The road was rutted, but the mud was hard, and if Mr. Lyman guided old Jack around the worst of the ruts, there should be no delay traveling on such a beautiful morning. Jip, sitting in the bed of the wagon, stroked the heifer's neck and half talked, half sang to keep her quiet. In a way, he was sad to see her go, but the sale would help out with the finances of the farm, now seriously strained with the addition of Putt and the Wilkins family to the population. It wasn't hard to tell when money was tight. The meals, meager at best, degenerated into a steady diet of mush, accompanied by a stream of complaints flowing from the head of the table to the foot and back again. So when there's less money, the meals are even worse than they are typically. In the good old days, as Mr. Lyman often reminded them, the able-bodied of the poor would have been let out to the highest bidder and would have brought a good bit of money to the town instead of draining the town purse. But some do-gooders, so in previously, the people who lived at the town poor farm who were able to work would have gone to work, and then they would have brought in some money for the town, brought in some money to the town instead of taking money from the town. But some do-gooders claimed this practice smacked too close to Southern slavery, so they began to put out the poor to the lowest bidder, the householder who proposed to take on the responsibility for the pauper at least expense to the town. This practice, alas, fell into disfavor as the ever-vigilant do-gooders sniffed out cases of abuse and claimed near starvation. So out of Christian charity, the town had purchased for their benefit, this wonderful farm, and had hired the Lymans to manage it and the lives of all those unfortunate paupers for whom the town must be responsible. So in the past, when someone was poor and didn't have any place to live, they would be sent to work at someone's house. Basically, they would be kind of sold to somebody like a master, but the townspeople realized that was too much like slavery. So they started having the poor go to help the people who couldn't pay a lot to the town but would not cause the town expense. But again, that was decided that was more like abuse. And so they decided to purchase the town poor farm for them to live on. So right there in that paragraph, Catherine Patterson is kind of going back to tell us a little more of the backstory about how the town farm came to be. And at this point, the manager invariably sighed. The task of keeping the farm from becoming an undue tax burden on those same generous citizens fell entirely to him. Mr. Flint, the overseer of the poor, cared for nothing but balanced books and an unruffled citizenry. And how, pray tell, was Mr. Lyman supposed to make the farm pay for itself, with only 2 able-bodied males among the residents, one of them a boy of unknown age, who could not or would not succeed when he was hired out, and the other a simpleton? So I was talking about Jip and Sheldon, right? Jip would have felt more guilt or even more sympathy if the manager himself had been more industrious. After all, he seemed perfectly able-bodied, if a bit on the plump side. He was neither young nor simple, but Jip supposed himself only an ignorant boy and not up to understanding the problems of his elders. So apparently Mr. Lyman doesn't work very hard on the farm. The sun warmed Jip's head and shoulders. Winter was nearly gone at last, and though a May snow was not unknown, it wasn't likely. He hardly minded that by June he would be at work from dawn to dusk. He was not a stranger to work. Sometimes he racked his brains to recall who had done the milking, plowing, seeding, cultivating, picking, and reaping before Mr. Lyman determined that Sheldon had the muscles and Jip had the sense to carry out all these tasks. Still, he could enjoy a rare holiday from work. He longed to stretch out full length in the wagon and bathe in the sunlight. He was sleepy. He'd hardly had a full night's rest since Putt came. Often he slept by the cage in case the lunatic got to raving in the night. Was it true what Berthy said about the full moon making him crazier? Jip couldn't be sure. Putt's bad spells didn't seem as regular as the phases of the moon, and it certainly didn't take a full moon to unhinge him. At least Putt was less agitated when the sun was shining, and summer with its long golden days was sure to come. The wagon hit a bump in the rutted road. Mr. Lyman grunted a curse word and smacked the reins against Jack's patient back. The calf gave a startled little bleat. "Shh, shh," Jip whispered. "You ain't going to slaughter. No need to fear. Someone's going to buy you for a nice milk cow. You're a little beauty, I tell you. You'll live to a ripe old cow age, you will." The little heifer twisted her neck to look up at him with worshipful brown eyes. He did love a calf. When Bonnie delivered a stillborn, it tore him apart. Even though with no calf to milk, it meant more milk, butter, and cheese for the residents. So when a cow has a calf, much of the milk that the cow produces will go to feed the calf. And when a the calves. Remember, before Jip was able to treat Bonnie in a way that helped her to have a calf. Um, when the calf was born not alive, it was born dead. That's what stillborn means. Um, he was really sad about it, but it did mean that they had more milk and butter and cheese because there was no calf there to drink the milk. They were approaching the edge of the village. As always, he stared at the large houses as they passed. Curtains made the houses look plump and sleepy-eyed as they sat comfortably amongst their luxuriant shade trees. Their beautiful shade trees. What did people do in the village? They couldn't all work in the mill or the livery stable or at the harness maker's. They didn't seem to keep chickens, much less a cow, and aside from the few garden plots which had not yet been planted, it was hard to see how the rich ate, let alone how they prospered. Overseer Flint, for example, was called a banker. Jip had even seen the so-called bank, a squat, one-story clapboard structure near the village green. But what did people do in banks? He knew it was somehow related to money, but what? You didn't grow money. Why would you need a building for it when a mattress or jar or even a drawer would be much more handy? A visitor to the poor farm years ago had, upon leaving, handed Jip a copper penny. Since it was the only money the boy had ever possessed, he always carried it with him in the pocket of his trousers. The donor had said to Jip, "Now save this, my boy. A penny saved is a penny earned." So Jip had obediently saved it, but it hadn't earned him any more. Jip couldn't figure for the life of him how the man had thought it might. A penny wasn't a hen that could hatch a bunch of copper chicks. A penny saved is a penny earned. And that's an old saying, meaning if you save your pennies, it's just as good as earning them, because once you've saved enough of them, you'll be able to do or buy what you want to buy. But if you spend them all the time, then you won't have your earnings. You won't save up your earnings. But Jip couldn't figure out what the man meant by a penny saved is a penny earned. Because a penny wasn't like a hen that could hatch a bunch of chickens. A penny couldn't hatch a bunch of little pennies. Once last fall, when he happened to be in the village, he had come close to spending his penny. Peck's store had candies, all different shiny colors, and they were 10 for 1 penny. He was sorely tempted. Those 10 candies would give him and Sheldon at least 5 days of pleasure. But the visitor's warning had stopped him. This particular penny must be destined for greater things than sweets for him and Sheldon to suck. They were nearly at Peck's now, but the wagon didn't stop. First, they would deliver the heifer on the far side of the village and get the payment for it. Then, perhaps Mr. Lyman would stop at the store. Jip hoped so. He loved to see the bright candies in their glass jars lined up like a row of rich village girls in their Sunday calicos. Looking was free and did no harm. Sunday calicos, that would be fancy dresses. The girls, usually calico is kind of a flowery material, little flowers. He lifted the calf down from the wagon, nearly falling under the weight of it. Mr. Lyman was in his good suit, couldn't be expected to handle livestock. Jip bent over and gave the calf a secret goodbye kiss, and then climbed back up into the wagon. Mr. Lyman did stop at the store, but to Jip's disappointment, he ordered the boy to stay with the horse while he ran his errand. Jip clambered up to the wagon seat, leaving the reins loose across Jack's broad back, and watched as the manager climbed the steps. Just as Mr. Lyman reached the entrance, a man came out, and the two of them dodged each other in the doorway with bows and nods. Jip gazed longingly at the storefront, his mouth all set for the candies he imagined his penny might have fetched. For a second, the stranger's eyes met his own. The man looked startled. Then, shifting his gaze, came down the steps and over to the wagon. "Waiting for your papa?" he asked. There was something sticky and syrupy about the man's tone that made Jip want to lie, but the sin of lying was too heavy for his conscience, so he shook his head. "Your uncle?" Why did the man care who Mr. Lyman was? Besides, he ought to know without asking. Everyone knew Mr. Lyman. "No kin, eh?" Jip neither nodded nor shook his head, but turned away to stare at a wagon passing on the road. The stranger was nosy and rude. He had no business asking such questions. Best to ignore him. "Where you livin', sonny?" The man waited, and when Jip failed to answer, added impatiently, "No cause to be unmannerly. I'm just making friendly conversation, you know." Jip didn't know. That was the point. The man's words didn't seem friendly at all. To his great relief, Mr. Lyman came out of the store soon after, already stuffing his newly purchased tobacco into his pipe. Jip handed him the reins and climbed back to the wagon bed, being careful not to look down at the stranger, who had yet to move away. "Your pardon, good sir." Mr. Lyman ignored this greeting. So that was a stranger saying that. "Your pardon, good sir." Mr. Lyman ignored this greeting, clicked a command to the horse, and with a slap of the reins pulled away, leaving the man standing there, red-faced and open-mouthed. "Who was that stranger you was talking to, boy?" the manager asked as they left the village. "I wasn't talking, sir. He was. He was asking me if I was some relation to you." The idea clearly displeased the manager. "Don't make up to strangers, boy." "No, sir. It warn't his business if we was kin or no, which we are not." So kin is, again, related to somebody. "He's not been in these parts before. What's he doing around here?" "That I don't know. I didn't tell him nothing, sir." Mr. Lyman gave a grunt and said no more. Still, when Jip and Sheldon came in from the hen house next afternoon, there was a stranger having a cup of tea and biscuits with Mrs. Lyman right there in the farmhouse kitchen. The stranger must have found out from someone where the wagon had come from. It seemed unlikely to Jip that he had made his way out to the farm by accident. The town farm wasn't what you could call on the road to anywhere else. The man raised his eyes as the two of them opened the door. Jip caught the man giving him a quick once-over, meaning looking him over. But he turned right back to Mrs. Lyman, chatting about the prospect for a late frost as though he and the manager's wife were old friends. Jip washed the eggs and put them carefully into the basket. He wondered if Mr. Lyman knew that the stranger was poking his nose into the very kitchen of the farmhouse. The boy shivered. There was something wrong. The unknown man from the store now chittering away in the kitchen, having himself a cup of the manager's tea, as though he was some welcomed and very familiar guest. Not even a parlor visitor, a kitchen one. So that expression right there, not even a parlor visitor, a kitchen one. So if you were having someone over as company, you would have them come into your parlor, and it would be all set up nicely, and your best furniture would be in there, your best everything your best, so that it looked good to whoever came to visit. But a kitchen guest, somebody who comes to your kitchen, they're somebody you're so comfortable with that you're not trying to show off for them. So if you have someone who comes, it's like coming to your back door and making their way right in. "Come on, Sheldon," he said. They left the room as fast as Jip could pull Sheldon out. Jip kept clear of the house until he saw the stranger well on the road toward the village. He was a tall man, close to Mr. Flint's height, dressed in dark, formal-looking clothes and walking, not heavy like a farmer or even proud like a banker, but like a kind of, one night Jip had seen a weasel slinking around the chicken house looking for a hole to slide through. It was sort of like that. The man stopped, looking back up the road toward the farmhouse. Jip jerked out of sight behind the shed. Ooh, man's like a weasel, slinking around the chicken house looking for a hole to slide through. All right, so we've got another character in our story now. The stranger. The stranger who gives Jip a creepy feeling. And look at the next chapter. Beware the stranger. Okay, we'll read that tomorrow.